Hilchos Brachos, Perek Shishi, Laws of Blessings, Chapter 6. We've covered all the laws that are relevant to Birkat Hamazon, the biblical mitzvah of Brachot. And now we move on to another element that's connected to eating bread, but this time not after the meal, before the meal. Nitilat Yadayim. Till now we've kind of been taking it for granted. We've been speaking about when you make hamotzi, when you don't make hamotzi. But an important part of making hamotzi and eating bread is, of course, the washing that takes place before. Today we know it in our custom. We wash 3 times on the right, 3 times on the left. But it's much more involved than that. There are many laws that are connected to Nitilat Yadayim. And today we're going to be discussing the Rambam's summation of all the laws that are related to this area of Jewish law. It says the Rambam Halacha Aleph, Kol ha'ochel pat shemavarchin alav hamotzi. Anytime a person eats bread upon which the blessing is hamotzi, tzarich netilat yadayim tchila vasof. He needs to wash his hands before and after. Before is the washing that we're familiar with. The after is a reference to mayim acharonim, the water that we wash our fingertips with at the end of the meal. And according to the Rambam, they're both in the same category. It's washing the hands before and after. The afal pi shehi pat chulin, even though, says the Rambam, that this bread is not holy, it has no sanctity to it. The afal pi she'en yadav meluch lachot. And even if your hands aren't dirty, ve'eno yodea lehen tuma, and you don't know of any ritual impurity which they contracted, lo yochal ad sheyitol shtei yadav, you cannot eat till you wash both your hands. Now, the reason why the Rambam says even though it's not holy is because initially the practice of washing hands was made for truma, for the gifts to the Kohen. I put up this picture because, not because it's necessarily related to this topic directly, but because it's very important to keep on reviewing this general knowledge about the gifts of produce. Whenever a farmer would take his crop, the first thing he had to do was give gifts to a Kohen. 2% was called Truma Gdola. It went to the Kohen. And a Kohen has to eat his Truma in a state of purity. And therefore he would always wash his hands before eating Truma. Nevertheless, the sages enacted that even on chulin, even on regular food, regular produce, regular bread, we should still wash our hands before. And as a matter of fact, that was only in temple times. After temple times, the rabbis came and added even further that we should still continue this practice of washing our hands. And we do, till today, which is why the Rambam says that even though it's chulin, even though it's mundane crop, mundane bread, you still do the nitlat yadayim. And the Rambam adds, V'chein kol davar shetibulo b'mashkin. The truth is, not only things that we eat that are hamotzi, anything which is normally dipped into liquid, tzarich netilat yadayim tchila, must go through netilat yadayim before we eat it. We're not so accustomed to this because many people don't keep this law nowadays. One time of year when we all do is at the karpas. On the Seder night, we dip a vegetable in salt water, and before we do the karpas, we do the second stage of the Seder called urchatz, when we wash our hands 3 times on the right, 3 on the left, like for bread without a blessing. That's what the Rambam is referring to here. In times of old, we used to do this any time they ate something dipped into liquids. Many people that I know actually still do it till today when you eat a pickle, since it was pickled in liquid. And so it's a thing which is tibulo b'mashkin. They would actually wash their hands before. But again, it's not so commonly kept today, but on the Seder night, we still do that. We want to be as holy as we can on that night, so we do wash our hands for that. By the way, the Rambam over here just makes note of washing your hands. It doesn't say how many times. We're familiar with 3 times on the right, 3 on the left, but the commentaries point out that according to the Rambam's simple reading, even 1 time on each hand will be enough. We'll see later on in the chapter that you might need 2, but the simple reading here is just wash the hands. Wash the hands even once is okay. Halacha bet kol hanotel yadav, when a person washes his hands. Bein la'achila, bein likriyat shema, bein latfila, whether it's before eating, as in the case we're talking about here, or for before reading Shema or before davening, as we discussed in the earlier parts of this book, that before saying Shema or washing or davening, one of the prerequisites is to have clean hands, and you wash your hands for that. According to the Rambam, on all 3 they are commandments from the rabbis, mevarech tchila, and therefore you make a blessing before you do it. Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. Hashem made us holy with His mitzvahs and commanded us to wash our hands. Notice the Rambam says you make the blessing before. That's the Rambam's opinion. Like every mitzvah, you make the blessing before doing it. Today we're familiar with the custom to make the blessing after. We wash the hands, bring them into a state of purity, then make the blessing. Now, why are we saying Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu? There's no mitzvah in the Torah to wash your hands. It's a rabbinic enactment. Says the Rambam, and with this he clarifies a general principle that applies to all rabbinic mitzvahs, shezu mitzvat chachamim, although it's a mitzvah from the sages, but shenitztavinu min haTorah lishmoa mehen. We have a command from the Torah to listen to whatever the sages enact. Shene'emar, as it says, Al pi Torah asher yorucha, based on the Torah that they teach you, that's what you should follow. And because they commanded us to wash netilat yadayim before we eat, it qualifies as saying, V'tzivanu, Hashem commanded us with His mitzvahs and commanded us to listen to the sages, included in which is the mitzvah to wash our hands before eating. Says the Rambam, that's only for the water before the meal. Umayim acharonim, the water after the meal, when we wash our fingertips, ein mevarchin alehem, we don't make a blessing on them. She'enam ela mipnei sakana, they're only, as we're going to see soon, as a protective measure from danger. And whenever we're doing something out of protection from danger, we don't make a blessing. Doesn't mean you should treat it more lightly. Matter of fact, the Torah, the Talmud says, danger is even more stringent than matters of plain prohibition. So don't treat it lightly just because you don't make a blessing. You treat it even more carefully. But because it's only for sakana, we don't make a blessing. Says the Rambam, halacha gimel netilat yadayim ben tavshil le tavshil. There's another concept of washing, what's called mayim emtsaim. We have mayim rishonim, the first water, we're washing before the meal. Mayim acharonim is washing our fingertips after the meal. Then you have what's called mayim emtsaim, where between courses or between dishes, people used to wash their hands. Says the Rambam, that's not part of the mitzvah. Washing hands between cooked food, one dish and another, reshut, it's optional. Ratza notel, ratza eno notel. You want, wash. You don't want, don't wash. Upirot shel chulin, if you're eating fruit or other produce, that's mundane, it's not truma, not bread, einan tzrichin netilat yadayim, they don't require at all washing of the hands. The only reason we wash our hands for bread that's chulin is because it's related, similar to truma bread. But once you go out of the category of bread, you're into the category of fruits, no longer is washing of the hands required. Ben batchila, ben basof, but the beginning, both the end. And the Rambam says even more, if you want to be extra pious, you think to yourself, I'm going to be extra holy, I'll wash my hands even for fruit. That's considered to be haughty. We don't be extra holy than what we have to be. Kol pat shehamelech bo, any bread that has salt in it, tzarich netilat yadayim b'acharona, is what requires washing of the hands at the end of the meal. Shema yesh bo melach sdomit, because perhaps there is what's called the salt of Sodom. This is the reason why mayim acharonim was enacted. There was a salt that was very, very strong, came from the area of Sodom. O melach shetiv'o kemelach sdomit, or there was salt that had the nature of salt of Sodom. And you're going to pass your hands over your eyes afterwards and you're going to become blinded. By washing your hands right after the meal, that protects you from that sakana. Because of this, we're obligated to wash our hands at the end of every single meal. Because of this, salt. Now I tried searching up what the salt of Sodom is. This is supposed to be a picture of it from Wikipedia. Very thick salt. And there was somebody in Israel who did a bunch of research on it, came up with that it's the salt that's produced from carnallite. It's one of these chemicals that can be found at the top layer of big salt areas. And when you make salt using this, it becomes extremely, extremely strong and could blind you. And apparently this stuff was mixed into the salt that was common practice in those days to use. And therefore the rabbis enacted this concept of mayim acharonim, washing your hands. By the way, only men do it, not women. Because, as the commentaries say, women didn't usually get their hands in the food. And therefore, they didn't have to have this danger of blinding their eyes. Says the Rambam, when you're in the camp, in the army, pturim minitilat yadayim batchila, we exempt them from washing hands to begin with. Again, it's not a ritual requirement. The requirement is only for truma. Once you're dealing with regular food, so we say in any case where it's too much to ask to do this washing, we don't do it. For example, in the army, because they're bothered, they're busy thinking about the war. But nevertheless, even soldiers in the army base have to wash mayim acharonim. Here you see how the sakana is treated more stringently than the isur. The mitzvah from the rabbis of Netilat Yadayim we ignore for the army. But protecting yourself from danger? No. Even in the camp, you must do it. Halacha Dalet says the Rambam ad hechan hi netilat yadayim. When you wash your hands, till where do you wash? How much of the hand must be washed? Ad haperek. You have to wash till the joint, which the commentaries explain according to the Rambam means until the wrist. Other commentators say it means till here, but the accepted halacha is till the wrist. The kama shiur hamayim, how much water is required to be used for this washing? Revi'it lechol shtei yadayim. 1 revi'it, about 3-4 ounces, is required for every set of 2 hands. And the rule is v'chol shechotzetzim batvilah. Anything which is considered an interruption or an intervening substance is the way they translate it here between your hand and the water when it comes to mikvah, Chotzetz benitlat yadayim also is considered to be an intervening substance when it comes to washing of the hands. Later on in the 10th book of the Rambam, he has a whole section called Hilchot Mikvaot. The second chapter is dedicated to the laws of chatzitza, what's considered to be substance that intervenes between your body and the water. Because when you go into mikvah, you have to be fully in. Nothing can be blocking. And he gives you the whole list of what's considered a chatzitza. So the Rambam says, check the list over there. Whatever is considered a chatzitza there is considered to be a chatzitza, intervening substance over here for washing of the hands. The chol ha'oleh lemidat mikveh. Similarly, a mikveh, we know, has to be what's called 40 sa'ah. Sa'ah is a liquid measurement. And has to be 40 of those of fresh rainwater. And in different cases, there are other substances that can count towards the water. For example, if you're in a muddy area, sometimes the mud, if it's wet or liquid enough, can count as water. It's also discussed in the laws of mikvahs in the 10th book of the Rambam at length, all the different things that could count towards the 40 sa'ah of water. So the Rambam says, whatever waters or liquids count for that, oleh l'shi'ur riviyit can also count to make up the riviyit, the 3-4 ounces that are required for netilat yadayim. Halacha hey, kol tzarich netilat yadayim. Anybody who required to wash his hands for a meal, for shema, for davening. And instead of washing his hands with water, he decided to dip his hands into a kosher mikvah. He requires nothing else. We're going to see later at the end of the chapter that when you wash your hands, you have to dry them after you eat. Commentaries say, you have to dry them before you eat. The commentaries say here, when the Rambam says, nothing else is required, they mean that dipping your hands into a mikvah could be so powerful that it may not even require you to dry your hands. If you dipped your hands into water that could technically qualify as a mikveh, but there isn't enough to make them a kosher mikveh, or in simply water that has been gathered into the ground. It's not fresh from a spring or fresh from rain. Let's say it's water you took from your sink and you put it into a basin, and you're dipping your hands into the basin. Lo asak klum, it doesn't count for anything. She'ein hamayim she'uvin mitarin etayadayim ela binetila. Because once you have water that has been drawn out from its source, the only way to use it for nitilat yadayim is to actually wash your hands with them from a vessel, not to dip them into something else. That only works if it's a kosher mikveh. Halacha vav, now the Rambam introduces, like he did when it came to Shema and it came to davening, a list of a couple of things that are required before you do the exercise. Halacha vav, kol hanotel yadav. Whenever you're washing your hands for nitilat yadayim, tzarich lihizaher ba'arba'a dvarim. You have to be careful about 4 things. There are 4 requirements for nitilat yadayim to be kosher. B'mayim atzman, you have to check the waters. Shelo yiyu psulin nitilat yadayim. They shouldn't be disqualified for use for washing of the hands. Ubashiur, you have to check the amount of water that you're using. Sheyeh bahen revi'it l'chol shtei yadayim. There should be enough, a revi'it, about 3 to 4 ounces of water for every set of 2 hands. Uvakli, you have to be careful with the vessel that you're using to pour the water onto your hands. Sheyiyu hamayim shenotlin bahen bekeli, that the water that you're going to use for washing should be in a proper vessel that's qualified as a vessel according to Jewish law. Ubanotel, and the one pouring the water, sheyiyu hamayim ba'in mikoach noten. There's a principle we're going to discuss later, that the water needs to come from the power of another human who is pouring the water over your hands. It could be yourself, it could be somebody else, but it has to come from somebody. It can't be coming naturally down from somewhere else or mechanically, as we'll see. Halacha zayin, the Rambam now going to go through each of these 4 things, starting with the water. Arba'a dvarim poslin et hamayim. There are 4 things that can get in the way, that can disqualify water from being used for washing of the hands. Shinui mar'eh, change of appearance. Vigilui, being left overnight, uncovered. Va'asiyat melacha bahen, using them for work. They have said, and such a type of destruction, that would stop an animal from drinking them. If an animal won't touch this water, you shouldn't use it for washing of the hands either. Ketzad, how does this look? Let's talk about this. Mayim shenishtanu maritan. Let's talk first about water whose appearance changed. The color simply changed. Bein bekelim, bein bekarkaot, whether the change of color took place while they were in a vessel or while they were in the ground. Bein machamat davar shenafal letochan, bein machamat mekoman, whether because something fell into it or because of their place. Here you see examples of both. This is something where you put food coloring into a cup of water. Now the water changed because of something that fell into it. This is rusty water. You open a sink sometimes in these old apartments, or it could happen in your house as well. There's rusting in the water pipes and the water comes out of your sink and now it looks rusty. So because of their place, where they were in these rusty pipes, it became discolored. So therefore, that makes the water disqualified for using nitlat yadayim. Harei elu psulin, these are disqualified. The second thing is nitgalu gilui ha'oserotan mishtiyah. If they were left uncovered in a way that would disqualify them from being from drinking nifslu nitlat yadayim, they also became disqualified for washing of the hands. In the 11th book of the Rambam, we're going to have a section on guarding our health, different things that we should stay away from eating or drinking because of health and danger that it poses to the body. One of those things is water that was left uncovered or liquid that was left uncovered in certain situations overnight, different things in different areas. So the Rambam says, check that list. Anything that would disqualify the water from drinking also disqualifies the water from being used for washing of the hands. That covers 2 of the 4 things that could disqualify the water: discoloration and being left overnight. Halacha chet, now let's talk about work. Kol mayim shena'asa bahen melacha, any water with which work was done, na'asu shofchin, becomes considered to be sewer water. Upsulin nitlat yadayim, and it's disqualified for washing of the hands. Ketzad, what would be an example of doing work with water that now disqualifies it? Mayim she'uvin, let's say you had water that was drawn from a well, from somewhere. It's water sitting now in your cup or in your bucket. Shehidiach bahen kilim, now you use this water to wash your dishes. O sheshara bahen pito, or to soak your bread inside it. You wanted to make your bread softer, you put your bread inside it. V'chayotze bazeh, or anything like that. Bein bekelim, bein bekarkaot, whether this water for washing dishes or dipping bread was sitting in a vessel or it was sitting in the ground. Psulin, lintilat yadayim, you have made them disqualified for washing of the hands because that's considered work. You use the water for work. Heidiach bahen kelim mudachin o chadashim, but if you use this water to wash dishes which were already washed, or new dishes, lo paslan, you haven't disqualified them because you didn't do anything active with the water. You simply poured water over the dishes that were already clean. What about water that's used in baking? Apparently in old bakers' times, I tried looking for pictures, couldn't find one, but apparently bakers used to have 2 water bowls next to them. One in which they would put ready-made rolls or crackers as a softener, and one in which they would put their hands in to get more water as needed when they were kneading dough or to clean their hands. So the Rambam says, Mayim shahanachtom mitabel bahen et hake'achim. The water which a baker uses to dip rolls or crackers into them, psulin, they're disqualified because they've been used in the process of work. They did something to whatever accessory the baker was using. But if it's simply a water bowl from which the baker takes water into another bowl that he uses for kneading, let's say, ksherim, and the rest of the water in the bowl is kosher. It's the water in his fist that was the one that had work done to it. But the water which you drew from remained kosher. Now, the 4th thing which could disqualify water. Any water which has been disqualified from being drunk by a dog, even a dog won't get near it. Let's say they were bitter, or they were salty, or they were murky, or they smelled bad, to the point that a dog wouldn't eat from them. Bikelim, if this water is sitting in a vessel, psulin tlat yadayim, it's disqualified, you cannot use it for washing of the hands. But if it's in its kind of more of a natural place, if it's in the ground, even though a dog won't get near it, ksherim lahatbil, they're kosher, not to wash your hands with, but to dip your hands in, assuming they're the amount of a kosher mikveh. Chamei Tveria, the hot springs of Tveria, these exist even today in Israel. This is one of the streams that is more of an ancient type. Seems like how it used to look. Today they made it very modern. You can see over here, this is one of the modern Chamei Tveria. There's like 17 natural springs from which water flows in different ways. And they've gathered them into different pools, and you can actually go. Many people go during the year to wash in these waters. They're natural hot springs. Says the Rambam, bim koman, if they're in their place, in their natural place, you haven't moved them, matbilin bahen et hayadayim. They're kosher for dipping your hands in place of netilat yadayim. Aval im natal mehen bikli, but once you take some of the water into a vessel, o shehiflig mehen amal lemakom acher, or you diverted a channel towards a different direction. So now the water is not in its natural state. They cannot be used for washing, not the water before the meal, not the water at the end of a meal, because in essence, they're not fitting for an animal to drink from them. So they would go into the category of the beginning of this halacha, water which an animal wouldn't get close to. And as we said, so long as they're in the ground in their natural place, they're kosher. The moment you divert it, or you take it out of the ground, now you've disqualified it for netilat yadayim. Says the Rambam halacha yud, now we move to the shi'ur, the proper amount. You have to make sure there's a proper amount of washing. Yesh la notel liten al yadav ma'at ma'at ad sheyiten kashiur. Once you have the revi'it collected, the 3 to 4 ounces of water that's required, you can pour it on your hands at any speed. little by little till you spill the whole amount. You put the whole reviyit on your two hands at once, in one pouring, also kosher. Doesn't matter. And now the Rambam says a novelty. Notlin arba'a o chamisha ze b'tzad ze. You could have 4 or 5 people washing their hands, one near the other. O yad ze al gabe ze, or one hand on top of the other, b'shtifa achat, in one pouring. For example, like this is a kind of a picture, I guess you can see what it looks like. You have water coming from the top. 5 people have their hands under it. The water comes down and it will be considered to have washed each of their hands. So long as they keep their hands a little loose. So the waters will come to them. Again, the Rambam is referring to a case where it's not like this, but they're actually very close, one hand on top of the other. So they have to loosen it a little bit so the water can get in the spaces that's between the hands. Of course, if you're doing the 4 or 5 in one, you have to make sure that there's one revi'it, one set of 3 or 4 ounces per set of 2 hands. So per person that's participating in this exercise, you have to add more to the water, but once you have the entire amount of water, you just pour it onto all their hands, it washes them all as one, and it's all good. Halakha Yud Aleph, now we talk about the vessel that you use for washing. En notlin mayim layadayim. You cannot use to pour water onto your hands, lo bidofnot hakelim, walls of vessels. This is a reference to an earthenware vessel, that part of it came off, but the side, if you see, it's still rounded like a receptacle. Technically, you can fit water in there, and that can become your vessel. Says the Rambam, no. Walls of earthenware vessels are not kosher for washing of the hands. Similarly, v'lo b'shulei hamachatz, the bottom of a samovar. That's what they translated here, based on Rav Kapach's interpretation of the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah. This is an olden day samovar. You can see that the base was rounded and it was hollow. So if you turned it over, technically, you can fill it with water and use that as a vessel. No, because it isn't made for that, you can't use it for that. V'lo b'charasin, you also cannot use, as the commentaries explain, unshaped earthenware. So on the right, you have clay, it's unshaped, it hasn't been molded or formed into anything. And let's say you take it, and you want to make it into a little round receptacle, a little vessel for washing, and use it for washing your hands, not okay. V'lo b'megufat hachavit, also the cover of a jug is not permitted. You can see here you have a classic earthenware jug. On top of it is a cover. The cover was rounded. Technically, you can turn it over and fill it up with water, but because it cannot stand on its own in that state, because it has a little pointy thing coming out, therefore it's not kosher for washing of the hands. But if you fixed this cover for washing, you cut off that little pointy thing and you designated it for washing of the hands, you can use it for nitilat yadayim. Let's say you had a pouch that was usually used for wine, didn't typically have a stand, it was kind of loose, and you fixed it up in a way where it would stand. The Rambam says you can use it for washing of the hands. But if you have a box or a sack that had many little holes in it, typically would not allow liquid to gather in it, and you fix them in a way where, let's say, you painted it with tar or pitch or something which would hold the water inside, says the Rambam, they cannot be used for washing of the hands. So they explain over here in the notes, what's the difference? How come a pouch couldn't be used and a sack cannot be used? So he says, because the covering of a jug and a wine pouch are made ultimately for holding liquid. It wasn't in a proper position. Now you set it up right, now you're good. But a sack and a box aren't meant for liquids to begin with. So that therefore doesn't work even if you fix it. Similarly, you cannot pour water into your friend's cupped hands and say, oh, now I have a vessel. His cupped hands are not considered a vessel. If a vessel broke in such a way that had it been ritually impure, this breakage would cause it to become pure. In the 10th book of the Rambam, we have a whole section on the impurity of vessels, and the Rambam talks about in many cases where different levels of breakage cause ritual impurity to go away. Check that list. If you have a vessel which broke in a way that would bring it out of its state of ritual impurity, they're also considered to be no longer a vessel in regards to washing of the hands, and you cannot use them to pour water onto your hands, because now they're classified in Jewish law legally as broken pieces of vessels. Says the Rambam. But if you do have a whole proper vessel, doesn't matter the material. All vessels can be used to wash hands. Even vessels formed out of dung, animal manure, or earth. So long as they're whole. If you have a vessel which doesn't even hold a revi'it, the minimum required amount for washing of the hands, or currently it doesn't have are in it right now, of course you cannot use them to wash your hands. Why? Maybe you'll say, I'll take two little cups, 3 little cups, and I'll make it all be one amount. No, the vessel itself that you're using has to be capable of holding the entire amount of nitilat yadayim. Halacha yud gimel hakol ksherim liten leyadayim. Now let's talk about the person, because we said that the washing of the hands has to come from the power of somebody who's pouring it. Who's considered to be a somebody for this element? Says the Rambam, everybody. Everybody is kosher to pour water on your hands. Afilu cheresh shoteh v'katan. Even a deaf mute, a mentally unstable person, a child who are typically considered not to be sane enough or of mental maturity enough to fulfill different mitzvahs, they can be considered a giver or a pourer in this context. In ein sham acher, if there's nobody else around you, maniach hakli bein birkav v'tzak al yadav. You can put the vessel between your knees and pour it over your hands. This is assuming that you only have the exact amount required, so you have to get the whole amount onto both your hands at once, so you have to use your knees. Or you pour a barrel over your hands and you wash the hands. Or, if you have more water, of course, you can wash one hand and then pour it on the other hand, because you have enough water to cover both hands ultimately. Then you take the first hand and you pour it onto the second hand. Even a monkey is considered smart enough or a pourer enough to be one that can pour the water onto your hands. I tried looking up on YouTube for a video of this. It would have been very cute to find a monkey pouring water, but couldn't find one where a monkey was pouring water on other people. I found a monkey pouring water out onto the ground, but it didn't cover what we were looking for. Halacha yudalit. So for this, I want to show a little video about how irrigation used to work. Of course, today everything is with electric pumps and it's all beautiful, the way we get water to all the farms and all the things that, all the crops that need produce. But over here, you can see somewhat of the ancient ways that they used to do irrigation. This is a classic system. It's called the Rahat system in English. And what it is essentially you have a pulley system, which is full of buckets. And the buckets are filling up water from a source under, let's say, a well. And then there was one gear that was turning this thing constantly around, another gear that was turning these wheels around. Let's see if we can play the video.
For a long time now, farmers have been using...
And without that audio there. And basically what it is exactly as it describes. You have the first gear, the second gear, and then here is the water system where they're getting it from. The buckets go all the way down, they pick up the water, and as they come back up, they're being poured into a channel where the water then goes and irrigates the fields and the produce and all the other things. This is the pulley system of irrigation. There was also more of a manual system, which we'll see in a second here come up on the screen, which I believe is called the moat system. Yes, this is a simple manual way. You took yourself a bucket, or you used the pulley, no problem. It got you water from a well, it came up, and you simply poured it into a channel, which then got the water going for you. This is a third version, but those two are the ones that we want to show today for the Rambam's purposes. And says the Rambam, Hashoket, halacha yudalit. You have a trough, shedoleh adam biyado, o begalgal, v'noten letocha, which a person by hand picks out water from it, or with the pulley system, the wheel system that I showed you before. Maybe I could actually bring it up again. Don't see where my arrow is. Oh. So either you have the there we are. That's the pulley system right over there. And then you're pouring water into it. And the water then gets pulled into the channel, and they thereby get to feed, water, irrigate vegetables or an animal. And now you come, you put your hands into the channel, right over here, the trough over here. As the water is being poured into the channel, you put it there. Or if the human guy pouring the water, and you put your hands in the channel where he pours the water. And the water then passed and washed over your hands. Lo altano l'tila doesn't count for washing. Even though ultimately, in the beginning, it was a human being who poured the water, or the human being who was doing the pulley system, but in the moment of the water coming over your hands, there is no pourer that's pouring the water onto you. But if you put your hands right near the place where the guy poured out the bucket, till it turns out that the water is now washing over your hands. By the power of the pour that the human being did, al tan lo nitila, the wash has counted for you, and it's considered to be a kosher nitilat yadayim. Halakha tedvav, mayim shenistapek lo. So now we have the 4 things that disqualify water. We've went through all the details. Now let's talk about some other side points that arise from this. You have water, shenistapek lo im nasa min melacha o lo nasa. You're in doubt. Was work done with it? Was work not done with it? Im yesh bahen kashiur o she'en bahen. You're in doubt. Is there enough of the amount or not? Im hem teorin o tmein, are they ritually pure or impure? Safek natal yadav. Safek lo natal yadav. Or you're in doubt about the whole thing. Maybe I washed my hands, maybe I didn't. Sfekot tahor. By default, we can consider you out of doubt to be pure. Shekol safek shebetaharat yadayim tahor. Any doubt that arises in the circumstance of pure hands is considered to be pure. Halachat tetzayin mayim harishonim, the water which we use to wash our hands before the meal. Tzarich sheyagbia yadav lemala. You must pick your hands up after you're done washing. Ad shelo yitzu mayim chutz laperek, so that no water comes outside of the wrist. V'yachzeru v'yitamu et hayadayim, and then perhaps come back and impurify your hands. Water that goes onto your hands, assuming that there's a possibility that it was ritually impure, the water then also becomes impure. Now, if the water would go out of your wrist, it goes to like a no man's land area. If it comes back, it makes your hands impure again. So you must right away pick your hands up after washing. The acharonim, when it comes to the water after the meal, it's the opposite. You must lower your hands downwards, so all the power of the salt leaves your hands. Mayim rishonim, says the Rambam, a couple of differences between the water before the meal and the water after. Mayim rishonim, washing before the meal, nitalim, ben al gabe kli, ben al gabe karka, can be washed either into a vessel or onto the ground. But the water at the end of the meal, einan nitalin ela al gabe keli, must be washed into another vessel. That's why you'll see people bringing mayim achronim to the table. They always wash it into another vessel, because we don't want the salt to stay on the ground and go anywhere else. Mayim rishonim nitalin. When it comes to the water before the meal, they can be poured from bin bechameha or bin bitzonen, whether water that's been heated up by fire or cold water. The water at the end of the meal cannot be hot. Meaning hot in the way that your hand will be scalded from it if you touched it. Because they're not powerful enough to remove the dirt. Because then you can't rub your hands with it, it's too hot, you're getting it off your fingers and you don't get the salt off. But if they were lukewarm, you can use them to wash your hands at the end of a meal because they'll get the dirt off. Technically, a person could wash his hands in the morning, one time, make a condition that it's going to work for him all day, without being required to wash his hands for every time he eats during the day. However, because the whole idea is about ritual impurity, you can never divert your attention from your hands. But once you divert your attention, you'll have to wash your hands again every time you require washing of the hands. As the Talmud says, our hands are busy. They go places. And so if you're not focusing on them actively, you have to then wash your hands again later, which is as we do today. We don't rely on these one-time washings during the day. Wash your hands every time you need. Halakha Yudchet, another technical law. Lat Adam et Yadav b'malpa. Technically, the person doesn't have any water. He can wrap his hands completely with a cloth, and then eat bread or anything which would usually be dipped in liquid and requires washing of the hands, even though you didn't wash your hands in this case, because your hands are totally covered. If you're feeding other people bread or something that's usually dipped in liquid, you don't have to wash your hands over it because you're the feeder. But the one that's eating, not touching the food, doesn't matter, he has to wash his hands. Even though another person is putting it into his mouth directly, and isn't touching the food. Same thing if you're eating with a fork. You have to wash your hands. Fork is still considered to be an extension of your hands, and you have to eat by washing first. If you know somebody didn't wash his hands, you cannot feed them. Even though you're putting it right into his mouth, he's not touching it. Doesn't matter. Make sure he washes his hands first. You can't treat washing of the hands cheaply. The sages made many commandments about this. They warned us extensively about washing the hands. Even if you only have enough water to drink. You first use them to wash your hands a little bit and then only drink what remains. Talmud talks about a story. Rabbi Akiva was imprisoned. Rabbi Yoshua brought him water, and he wanted to use them for washing of the hands. So Rabbi Yoshua said, you have to drink. So he says, what can I do? The sages said that if you don't keep washing of the hands, you're liable to the death penalty. That comes first. But the Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father, also was told about him that when he found just a little bit of water, he used them for washing his hands before drinking. Halacha chaf, tzarich adam lenagev et yadav. Whenever we wash our hands for eating, we must first dry our hands, v'achar kach yochal, and then eat. By the way, I should say the blessing should be made before the drying. You ever see people, when they wash their hands for bread, they first rub their hands together as they're wet while they're making the blessing, then they dry. So it's wash, bless, dry, then eat. According to the Rambam, it will be blessed first, like we said before, then wash, dry, and then eat. If you eat bread without drying your hands, it's like eating literally impure bread. Now, when you're washing your hands at the end of a meal, also you have to dry, but you dry before making the blessing, Birkat HaMazon. You bench, say the grace after meals, right after washing the mayim acharonim. Do not make any interruptions. Don't interrupt between them with anything else. Even to drink water after you wash your hands at the end of a meal, asur is forbidden. Until you make birkat hamazon, until you do the grace after meals, because there should be no interruption between the mayim acharonim and the birkat hamazon.